Hello, and welcome to this training on Match, What, When, Why, and How for the CoC and ESG grants. We provide this training virtually in order to help our community have these trainings more accessible and in a way that better fits people's schedules so they're able to access them on their own time. This presentation will last between 45 to 50 minutes. If you should have any questions at the end of the presentation, I have included my email address in the PDF, the PowerPoint, so feel free to contact me with any questions about the material covered. One quick thing I do want to point out is that this training is an overview. It will not be specific to your agency or your accounting system, so we are going to try to keep it at that level. Feel free to ask agency-specific questions after you've viewed the presentation and to submit them to me via email, and I will be glad to respond. Our goal is to make sure that our agencies are fulfilling the requirements of the federal award by providing match that is eligible and well documented. Poorly documented or insufficient match can jeopardize our community's grant funding, and we want to be sure that we continue to receive all the resources necessary to further the mission of ending homelessness in Greater Cincinnati. Our second goal is to support you by facilitating the match process and to help you establish procedures that function in the quickest, most efficient, and most accurate way possible. Less time spent on paperwork translates into more time spent on ending homelessness. Here is a short overview of the topics that we will be covering today. Number 1, why match? Number 2, what is required of match, discussing both cash and in-kind match. Number 3, when is match due, covering dates and also necessary documents. Number 4, how to submit match. And then lastly, common problems encountered in dealing with match and match reporting. We will be discussing the federal match requirements with an eye towards some of the most common issues we have observed as part of both our on-site monitoring as well as the CoC application and recording process. The Continuum of Care grant is a cost-sharing grant. The federal government does not fund 100% of a project's budget. Federal regulations require that an agency provide matching funds to bear a proportion of these costs. It is the same idea as asking a participant in a rental assistance program to pay their portion of the rent. There could be severe consequences if we cannot provide the match for which we are obligated by HUD. Any shortfalls in match will result in grant money being paid back to HUD. In order to protect the community from this eventuality, sanctions may be put into place for agencies who fail to meet match requirements. The single most important thing you can do is to understand the terms and conditions of your agency's subaward inside and out. That will inform everything that you submit for the CoC match process. When you are unsure of what to do, refer to the regulations and/or the text of the subaward itself. It is equally important that you communicate the appropriate aspects of the subaward to your staff. They need to know what activities are eligible and exactly how they should be tracking and documenting those expenses. Important trainings and proper documentation and maintaining institutional knowledge. On more than one occasion in our community, we have had an agency where the one person who knew the match process left the company, and that left everyone who remained in a bit of a scramble trying to determine how to fulfill their match requirements because they did not have the institutional knowledge in place to maintain this record. Maintaining documentation and policies and procedures, good internal records maintained throughout the year, and knowing the documents required for reporting and monitoring match are all essential to a successful process. Please note that match transactions require the same level of documentation and support as transactions that are charged directly to the grant. If you are confused about anything in the subaward document or the federal regulations, please feel free to reach out to us. We will walk you through HUD's requirements. We will proceed by discussing the two different types of match. We begin with cash match. Cash match is when actual cash hits your books. It requires a cash match commitment form at the time of the CoC application. Also, it must be reported at the transaction level. HUD requires transaction-level detail for each item presented as cash match. Also, lastly, we have to be able to see what the cash was spent on to ensure HUD compliance. So a record of the transactions or the expenses that the match is being used to pay for is also essential. Program income is a type of cash match. Program income is defined as gross income earned by the non-federal entity, that's you, that is directly generated by a supported activity or earned as a result of the federal award during the period of performance. And a common example of this is if a client pays a portion of their rent directly to you rather than paying it to the landlord. If this is paid to you, then this qualifies as program income and must be reported as such. Our current CoC subawards include program income language that states that program income generated in our community will be used as match, reported consistently, and be well documented. This was part of HUD's monitoring of strategies in the year 2018. They checked and tracked our system for maintaining program income documentation and determined that we needed to do more and be more consistent in the way that we recorded and tracked program income throughout our community. If you have more specific questions about program income or how these requirements affect your individual agency, we will be glad to address them outside of this training. Now we will move on to InKind Match. InKind Match refers to goods or services received by your agency without actual payment. This requires an InKind Match commitment form at the time of the CoC application, as well as an executed MOU, a Memorandum of Understanding, between you and the agency providing the match. Just as with cash match, InKind Match must be reported at the transaction level. They also must be separated by project and by the source of InKind Match. A record of service hours is required, just meaning that the agency must have a record of how many hours participants are being served, not simply a dollar figure. Here are the 4 questions that you will be able to need to answer about InKind Match. Number 1, who is the source of the goods or services? Number 2, what specifically was donated? Number 3, how was the value determined? Again, this must be a specific and auditable breakdown of the total value determined for the InKind Match offered. And number 4, importantly, how has the value been verified? Now that we know what match is and why it is being required, we will discuss the when. There are 3 points during the year that agencies are required to provide match information for their projects. And right now this is referring to the CoC grant. Number 1 is the time of the CoC application, which is usually completed between July and August. Number 2 is during issues and conditions. This occurs after HUD has approved the grant, but at the time they may have additional questions or issues or conditions that must be met in order to fully execute the grant agreement. This may require additional match reporting or match documentation in order to fulfill HUD's requirements. And lastly, the 3rd time is the time of the annual performance report. This takes place within 90 days after the close of the grant, and is the required match reporting that must be submitted to HUD in order for the grant to be considered valid. One of the confusing parts of this process is that at any one moment, you will be in different phases for different grants. For example, you might be in July in the middle of applying for CoC funds for the coming year. You will also have just begun spending CoC grants for the current year. And you will have just closed and be getting ready to report on the CoC grant for the previous year. All of these things may be going on at the same time, and it can be very confusing to keep track of which documentation is required for which step at which point in the year. Again, feel free to reach out to us at Strategies if you have any questions or are confused about this process. Now we will go into more detail about what is required for each of these specific milestones. Number 1, the CoC application. This normally takes place in the middle of the year. The CoC application requires certain information about the type and amount of match for each individual project applying for CoC funds. Each project must know, number 1, who is providing the match, what kind of match it is, whether it's cash or in kind, and from a public or private source, and how much match is coming from each source. All of this information is covered in Strategy's Match to Commitment form, which is sent out well in advance of the deadline. Once HUD has reviewed the grant application, they will begin by letting us know about any issues or conditions for the grants. Essentially, issues and conditions are additional information or any updates to the data that was submitted in the CoC application. For example, if the fair market rent, or FMR, has increased, this will make the award given to most projects higher than what was originally applied for. However, with an increased project budget comes an increase in required match, and so documentation of this new match amount is required. Strategies will respond to the issues and conditions of the CoC grant and will contact the agency if necessary for help in resolving them. Also required from agencies at this time: 1, an updated cash match commitment form that includes additional details about match, and 2, a memorandum of understanding with any organization providing in-kind match. Strategies will provide a template, an MOU template, to use for this process. It is crucially important that you secure an MOU with each organization that will be providing in-kind match, and that all of these are provided to Strategies for review. Lastly, once the grant year is over, HUD requires an annual performance report, or APR, from any agency that receives CoC funds. The deadline for the APR is 90 days after the end of the grant. This contains program data about the population served, as well as financial data about exactly how the CoC dollars were spent. The APR requires a final report on match. A reminder that, as we mentioned before, transaction level detail is required for any charge that is used as match. For in-kind match, written confirmation is required from the agency with which you have an executed MOU, saying that services were rendered that met the standards put forth in the MOU. Match documentation should be ready to submit to Strategies for review within 30 days of the end of the grant year. This stresses the importance of documenting and tracking match throughout the year. APR submission should then be relatively straightforward. Strategies will provide templates for you to report this data to us so that we can convey that on to HUD. Once you have completed the APR process, then you are finished with match reporting, at least for that grant year. Lastly, we turn to how to report match. We've already covered the requirements at each step of the process, as well as the templates that Strategies will provide for you to use in reporting match. It is important to note, however, how to report match as part of the monthly grants disbursement report. You may recall from the billings training that match is required to be reported monthly. Even if that report is a note or statement to say that updated figures are not yet available, in other words, GCB only sends quarterly in-kind match reports, there still must be documentation to show that HUD's match requirements are being met. You can see here the different sections of the report. As is noted, match must be reported on a transaction level, at the transaction level detail. You are not required to use the grants disbursement report shown here. However, there must be some similar report included with each billing that enables Strategies to identify individual transactions. Summaries are acceptable so long as they are accompanied by a supporting schedule or similar report that has full detail. You can see here that there is an instance under the Program Income Match Expenses where it says multiple and it says see supporting schedule. And you will find here a sample of a properly completed supporting schedule to the section that said multiple on the previous slide. Now, we have so far discussed the match requirements for the CoC program. Match is also a requirement of the ESG program. While the deadlines for the ESG grant are different, and the process for applying for ESG funds is of course much different than that of the CoC program, the basic principles of match are the same. I've listed some of the similarities and differences above, but the key difference is the amount of money required for match. ESG requires 100% of grant funds be matched. This sounds like a lot, but since ESG grants are typically much smaller than CoC awards, and since there are usually many eligible shelter expenses that don't get reimbursed by the grant, matching ESG funds is typically not so much of a problem. If anyone has more specific questions about their ESG award, again, feel free to contact us and we will be glad to answer those. Now to discuss some of the common issues we have observed involving match reporting and documentation. Shown here is a year-end cash match report by the fictitious good agency. I have highlighted a few examples of some common problems and how best to avoid them. First, note that the agency is taking total expenses, subtracting what was charged to the grant, and using all of the rest as match. Now this might be appropriate, but we need to know if these unbilled expenses are eligible or not. Perhaps, for example, the $2,200 in community relations wasn't charged to the grant because it wasn't eligible. Simply subtracting grant charges from total expenses is not enough to determine matching funds. Second, note that the description for one account is PSH1XP Dev Rep. Most of the other accounts listed here appear to be eligible to be charged to the CoC grant, at least based on what we can see. We have no idea what this particular account is referencing, and so before submitting to HUD, we would need to know exactly what these charges are for. Thirdly, this cash match report is for $135,200, whereas only $100,000 is required as match for the grant. So does the agency want to present the full $135,200 as match, or just enough to meet requirements? It's impossible to tell. It looks like all of the amount is listed as match. Now, I should point out there is nothing wrong with reporting more match than is necessary. Just know that the full amount will be auditable and needs to meet all HUD requirements of documentation and eligibility as any other match charges. If we can't tell what we're looking at, then it does not meet the standard required of match documentation. Lastly, this report does not include transaction-level documentation of transactions presented as cash match. If your agency has been listed itemized transactions on your monthly billings, and the totals match the number you are reporting on your cash match report, then that will be sufficient. But a report like this on its own is not sufficient documentation of cash match. Many of these problems will be reduced by making sure to report match on your agency's monthly billings. Reporting match monthly means less time scrambling to do all of the work on a short deadline and fewer big surprises at the close of the grant year. Next, we are going to go step by step through a sample MOU, Memorandum of Understanding. We will be going through errors made on this sample form. I did want to point out some of the common errors that we see on this sample MOU shown here. First of all, notice that in the very first box, under source of contribution, it has government selected, but it doesn't have the specific government source. So, is this the state of Ohio? Is it the Federal Department of Health and Human Services? Is it the City of Cincinnati? We don't know. This additional information is required in order to complete the CoC application for HUD. Next, you'll see the box where it says description of services to be provided, and the response there is services for PSH participants. This is simply not enough detail. We need to know what the services are in order to determine if they are eligible services or not. Next, you will see towards the bottom there is a box where it states name and title of person authorized to commit these resources. Now we have a name, Dr. Susan Ramos, but we do not have the job title, which is required. And of course, a couple of boxes below that, Pretty obviously there is a signature missing where Dr. Susan Ramos is required to sign. Lastly, please note that the signature at the very bottom should be the signature of the subrecipient authorized representative, which in this case, according to what's been entered 2 boxes above, would be Jack Billingham, not Jim Maloney. I've included a reference to the specific federal regulations that govern Match. The ECFR website should be bookmarked in your browser for easy reference. We recognize that these are complicated programs, so I've listed our contact information below. Please feel free to reach out to us for assistance if you're having difficulty with the requirements. A reminder that our goal is to make sure that every agency in the community is able to fulfill the requirements of the federal award by providing match that is eligible and well documented. We want to be sure that we continue to receive all the resources necessary to further the mission of ending homelessness in Greater Cincinnati. Also, we hope to be able to facilitate you and your staff so that each agency is able to meet and exceed HUD standards and our goal to maintain and increase our community's level of funding. Thank you for what you do for our community. It is important work, and you can positively impact lives on a daily basis. If you have any additional questions about Match, again, please feel free to reach out to us at the email addresses listed on the previous slide. Thank you for your time in attending this training.